Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating, complicated, and honestly heartbreaking characters in all of literature, Karna from the Mahabharata.
And his entire story really hangs on one massive question, right? Was this guy just a tragic victim of fate, cursed from the moment he was born? Or was he the one who actually built his own downfall, choice by painful choice? That's what we're going to unpack.
So, to really get Karna, you have to start with the one thing that haunted him his entire life, his identity. Seriously, his whole existence was this agonizing search, constantly asking, who am I really?
And you can see this conflict perfectly in his two titles. On one hand, he was Sutaputra, the son of a charioteer, a low-status label that was thrown in his face constantly, like a shadow he could never outrun. But then, Duryodhana makes him Angaraj, the king of Anga. You'd think that would solve everything, right? But it didn't. That crown wasn't freedom, it was more like a gilded cage. It gave him power, sure, but not the deep-down respect he was so desperate for.
I mean, just look at this quote. This is Draupadi speaking after the war, in her moment of deepest grief. And how does she remember the man who played a part in her humiliation? Not as Angraj, the powerful king, no. She calls him a Sutaputra. That one word, even then, tells you everything. It shows you just how deep that label cut and how it fueled everything he did.
Okay, but here's the thing. That struggle, that chip on his shoulder, that's not the whole story. Not even close. Because underneath all that pain was a man with some truly incredible virtues. Qualities you'd be lucky to find even in the gods.
First up, his loyalty. It was just unshakable. His friendship with Duryodhana is the stuff of legends. And let's be clear, Karna knew Duryodhana was on the wrong path, the path of Adharma. He knew, but he never ever left his side. In fact, after the great Bhishma fell in battle, when the whole army was terrified and felt lost, who stepped up? It was Karna. He became this father figure, rallying everyone. That's loyalty. And then there was his generosity. Man, it was on another level, almost superhuman. They called him Danveer for a reason, the greatest of all givers. The most famous story, of course, is when he literally gave away his divine armor and earrings, the very things that made him invincible. He absolutely knew that doing this would mean his death, but he gave them away without a second thought, just because someone asked. Who does that?
And we can't forget, the man was a force of nature in battle, a Maharathi of the highest order. He was the only warrior who was considered a true equal to the legendary Arjuna. In fact, Duryodhana's entire confidence, his whole reason for thinking he could win the war, it all boiled down to one single belief. As long as I have Karna, I cannot lose.
So, you hear all that, right? Loyal, generous, a genius in battle. And it just begs the question, where did it all go so wrong? Well, now we have to turn the coin over. We have to look past all that shining virtue and into the darkness, at the fatal flaws that were hiding there all along.
You see, all those virtues were kind of built on a shaky foundation of insecurity. Because he was scorned his whole life, he was absolutely desperate for praise and couldn't handle even the slightest criticism. This wound up fueling this burning envy for Arjuna, and it led to his biggest mistake. He put his loyalty to one person, Duryodhana, above his duty to Dharma, that universal sense of what's right and just.
And if you want to see that ego in action, look no further than this. His own respected teacher, Kriparchaya, basically tells him to cool it with the bragging. And Karna's response? To threaten him? I will cut off your tongue. It just shows you how incredibly fragile his ego was. He couldn't take any challenge, not even from his own guru.
So these flaws, this ego, and this insecurity, they weren't just personality quirks. They pushed him to make choices. Choices he could never take back. Choices that absolutely sealed his fate.
And we can really zoom in on two key moments that were his points of no return. The first was a total moral failure. The second, a massive strategic mistake.
So let's talk about the dice game. This is so important. Karna wasn't just sitting there quietly while Draupadi was being humiliated. No way. He was an active participant. He was one of the loudest voices, mocking the Pandavas, cheering Duryodhana on. This was the moment his personal bitterness just boiled over and turned into this moral catastrophe. There was just no coming back from that.
The second moment happens on the battlefield. See, Karna had this weapon, the Shakti, a one-shot divine weapon that was a guaranteed kill on Arjuna. It was his trump card. But one night, the demon Gatotkacha is just tearing through their army, and Duryodhana panics. He begs Karna to use the Shakti. Now, a great general plays the long game, but Karna,
He caved to the pressure of the moment. He used his ultimate weapon to solve a short-term problem, and in doing so, he threw away his only real shot at winning the entire war. All right, so we've looked at his identity crisis, his incredible virtues, his terrible flaws, and those fatal choices. So what's the big takeaway here? What is the ultimate lesson of Karna's life?
Well, it takes us right back to that first question we asked. Was it fate or free will? Look, fate dealt him a really bad hand. There's no denying that. But at every single crossroad, in that dice hall, on the battlefield with that weapon, even when Krishna himself came and offered him a way out, Karna had a choice. And every single time, his actions, driven by his own character flaws, are what wrote his tragic story, not destiny.
There's a really great concept that explains this called Sangati, which basically means the company you keep. And man, the relationship between Karna and Duryodhana was just textbook toxic. Duryodhana fed Karna's ego with status and praise, and Karna used his incredible power to protect Duryodhana's wicked ambitions. They didn't bring out the best in each other, they brought out the absolute worst.
When you lay it all out, it's like a balance sheet that just doesn't work. For every amazing asset he had, there was a fatal liability on the other side, just canceling it out. Unrivaled skill, wiped out by a blinding ego. Immense power, corrupted by deep-seated envy. And his greatest virtue, that unwavering loyalty, it became his biggest weakness because it led him to compromise everything he should have stood for.
And this wasn't just something we figured out later. People saw it happening in real time. The royal narrator, Sanjaya, said this himself. He saw Karna's greatness. He knew how skilled he was, but he also knew it was all doomed. Why? Because skill and power mean nothing when they're fighting for the wrong side. In the end, character is everything.
And that right there is the tragedy of Karna. He was a great warrior, no doubt, but he could have been a truly great man. His story is this timeless warning that the search for fame, for honor, for respect, it can never, ever come at the cost of your own conscience. He chose the wrong path to get what he wanted, and in the end, he lost it all.
So, I'll leave you with a question to think about in your own life. We all think loyalty is a great thing, and it is. But when does it cross the line? At what point does our loyalty to a person or a group or an idea stop being a virtue and become a liability, a blind spot that makes us defend things we know deep down are just wrong?